What am I saying? Who did we come to talk to? Hey friends, my name is Romy Jo Swales. Thank you for clicking on this video and accompanying me on my second episode of a series called Highlights and History, where I talk about Afrocentric African history. So I believe that being knowledgeable about our history forms such an integral part of us being proud, unified, and in love with our unique identities. Every Wednesday, or Wednesdays, because I've worked out that this takes me a really long time to do, we'll be learning about key influential African people or developed societies in the greater African story. If that sounds like something you're keen on learning about and watching me do some makeup at the same time, then please consider subscribing, liking, leaving me a comment, and turning on your notifications. So if you watched my previous video, you're probably thinking like, Romy, why is your backdrop so lame and different? And you've only filmed like one video in the previous one. But turns out I'm actually like halfway across the world in Incheon, South Korea, quarantining at the moment. Yeah, all kind of last minute. If you don't know, I'm a professional dancer and I'm currently on tour with The Lion King, the musical, international. And we're opening a season here in Seoul, South Korea towards the end of January, God willing. I'll be here for a couple of months, and then once I move out of quarantine and into the place I'll be staying in, I'll make it look a little nicer. But for now, this is all I could do. Shout outs to my friends for giving me these fairy lights a couple months ago, and now I've put them to use. So, we'll work with it. As always, I've listed a couple disclaimers down below, so before you comment, just make sure you read it so we know we're on the same page. I've also listed all my references, so if you'd like to read further, please feel free to do so. There's quite a few. I do try to look up the pronunciations of these names and words, but sometimes it's unavailable on the internet really because there isn't enough information about it, especially in African history. So please forgive me if I pronounce anything incorrectly, and please feel free to point me in the direction of where I could find a place to learn how to pronounce it correctly. So once again, let's start off with some context and give you the backdrop to 15th and 16th century Central Africa and all the kingdoms that were involved. Oral traditions from the Central African region indicate that slavery existed in Africa long before their first interactions with the Europeans. It just had multiple forms. There were forms like domestic slavery, military conscription, slavery in the form of debt collateral, slavery for sacrifice purposes, and slavery as a form of a household asset. Often these slaves were acquired as a result of prisoners of war, especially in countries where they had huge expansion plans, like the Kingdom of Congo. They would then sell these slaves to other African countries or eventually the Europeans, but always regulated by Congo law. The difference between the slaves found in Africa during this period and the slaves that we see later in history during the transcontinental slave trade is that although these African slaves were slaves and second-class citizens, they still had a fair amount of rights. There was a growing demand for a thing called black ivory, which is essentially what the Europeans were calling slaves during that period, to use for the development of their new colonies like Brazil. 90% of slaves traded in the Trans-Saharan, Indian Ocean and Atlantic slave trade were captured by their own African brothers and then sold to the Europeans like the Portuguese. Let's be honest though, although slavery existed in Africa prior to the arrival of the Europeans, when they did arrive, the demand increased to a point where it completely reshaped the Central African region. And then, of course, once the Europeans left, the trade almost completely disappeared. Now, at this time, the Kingdom of Congo had a population of over 500,000 people, centralized leadership, extensive trade networks, engaged societies, expansion aims, and, of course, conflicts. Now, they had been interacting with the Portuguese, exchanging noblemen, being their main source of slaves, learning the Portuguese language and Roman Catholicism, ever since the first explorers arrived in 1483. Now, during this period, the Kingdom of Congo had spheres of influence over neighboring kingdoms like Nyongo, Kakongo, Loango, Matamba, and our main kingdom of today, Ndongo. So the Kingdom of Ndongo was actually a vassal state of the Kingdom of Congo until it gained a fair amount of independence in 1556. Now, the Mbundu region, which is a region in which the Kingdom of Ndongo was situated, was mainly populated by Kimbundu-speaking people, which is a Bantu language. And, fun fact, the origin of the name Angola comes from the Kimbundu word Angola, which means king. Now, the Kingdom of Ndongo tried for years to get the Portuguese to recognize them as an independent state, but they never did. Until, in fact, in 1575, the Portuguese, with the help of the Kingdom of Congo, actually took control of a seaside village named Luanda and made it one of their ports. But Luanda was part of the Kingdom of Ndongo, so this initiated a war that would last for decades. By the 1580s, the decade in which our heroine today was born, Ndongo had survived many brutal attacks by the Portuguese, where they seized approximately 80,000 slaves, as well as tons of Ndongon territory. You get the gist of it. The slave trade is popping off, the Europeans are plundering land, Africans are trying to maintain their territory, kingdoms are being ripped apart, so on and so forth. Now that all of that's out the way, let's talk about who we came to speak about today. Again, forgive me if I get these names wrong, I'm trying. It's 1583, and in the beautiful capital city, Kabasa, in the Kingdom of Ndongo, Kengele Kankombe has just named her newborn baby girl, Nzinga. You see, her baby had just survived almost being suffocated by her umbilical cord on the way out. And so it was only fitting that she be named Nzinga, which is a derivative of the Kimbundu verb kujinga, which means to twist or turn. Although this is a fairly stressful ordeal for Mbandi Kuluwanji and his favorite concubine Kengela, royal children born under difficult circumstances was said to possess spiritual gifts. Between her two sisters, Kambu and Funji, and her brother Mbandi, who was the heir to the throne, Nzinga was the apple of her father's eye, and he just loved spoiling her and giving her gifts. And it was okay because she was never going to become king anyway, so it wasn't seen as competition between her and her siblings. After her father ascended to the Ndongan throne when Nzinga was just 10 years old, he insisted that she train as a warrior, become adept with a battle axe. She learned to speak and write Portuguese, participate in many official and governance duties alongside her father, join in on legal councils, war councils, participate in important rituals, and even join him on the battlefield. I mean, for someone who wasn't meant to become the future king, she was really giving a lot of future king feelings. Unfortunately, her father's rule was wrought with crisis after crisis, and he did everything he could to remedy the situation. He literally had mediation, diplomacy, he went to war, but nothing worked. A smart move on his part was to form an alliance with a neighboring kingdom called the Kingdom of Matamba, who were quite strong. In order to fend off the Portuguese, regain some lost Ndongan territory, he was still pretty ineffective, and during his rule lost a lot of support and trust of his noblemen, to the point where they actually sided with the Portuguese. So far in the story we've learnt about the Kingdom of Portugal, the Kingdom of Congo, the Kingdom of Ndongo, the Kingdom of Matamba, and now enter to the story the Imbangala people. They were ruthless nomadic mercenaries who looted and seized land, rumored to be cannibalistic and cult-like in nature. See, the Imbangalas are important because in 1617 the Portuguese enlisted their help to attack Ndongo, overthrow their cities and their capital, place a sympathetic Portuguese ruler in power, enslave and dehome many Ndongan people, as well as force the royalty to flee. Now, in the same year as this attack, Nzinga's father sadly passes away, and the throne was ascended by her brother Mbandi, who was basically just as ineffective, useless, bad at leading, a male obviously, and no, I'm kidding. Am I? I'm kidding. In order for the new king to ensure his rule, he committed many horrific acts to wipe out potential threats to his throne. He killed his brother and his brother's family. He killed Nzinga's son. She had a son. He forced all of his sisters to undergo sterilization, and some reports say that Nzinga actually endured the worst of the persecution because she was so highly favored. So because Mbandi was useless, when the Portuguese and the Imbangala people invaded Ndongo, they forced him to flee to a nearby group of islands called Kidonga, and Nzinga ended up fleeing to the Kingdom of Matamba. A couple of years of continued fighting, the Portuguese plundering more land, imprisoning and dehoming Ndongans, making them slaves. They were like, okay, let's invite this King Mbandi to Luanda to make some sort of peace agreement. Now, knowing that he lacked the skills needed for successful negotiations, King Mbandi instead asked his sister to go to Luanda because he knew she was intelligent, charismatic, she could read and write and speak Portuguese fluently, as well as she was really well informed about the current affairs of the neighboring African kingdoms. So, armed with her entourage and advisors, blessing from the king to be baptized, the power of the name of the king, and a solid plan, Nzinga left for Luanda. Initially, her main aim was to assert her dignity and equality. See, traditionally, when African leaders went to meet with Portuguese or the Europeans in general, they would usually dress in Western clothing. But Nzinga was like, absolutely not. So she rocked up there in opulent, traditional clothing adorned with beads and feathers, just like the royalty she was. Famously, during her first meeting with the Portuguese, she entered the room and noticed that all the Portuguese individuals had been given chairs to sit on, and they'd laid out a mat for her to sit on. And this was usually how the Portuguese tried to assert their dominance. She took one look at what was going on, called over one of her assistants, and was like, make a chair for me. He fashioned himself into a chair, and she sat down for that entire meeting so that she could look the Portuguese governor face to face while they discussed things. This didn't mean that the Portuguese didn't like her though. Oh no. She was enchanting, she was cunning, she was clever, she was charismatic, until eventually by the end of this diplomatic mission, they'd actually reached a treaty. In order to solidify the peace treaty between Portugal and Nzinga, Nzinga had to be baptized into the Christian faith and change her name to Dona Ana de Sousa. The reason why I'm glazing over it is because it actually wasn't kept for very long. Pretty soon the Portuguese were caught up with the Congo further north, and Nzinga's brother, who was being pretty useless, wasn't able to take back the capital city in time. The Portuguese wouldn't really help him. He also wouldn't convert to Christianity, and then he got super depressed, and then Nzinga actually ended up taking on a lot of his roles. So, yeah, didn't last very long. In 1624, Nzinga's brother Mbandi actually passed away. Some sources say under strange circumstances, and others say that he committed suicide. But either way, she succeeded him. At first, though, only as regent and not as queen, because Mbandi actually had a son who was currently under the custody of an Imbangalan chief named Kasa. In order to get a hold of Mbandi's son, she ended up marrying Kasa, the guy whose custody the son was in, and then after the wedding, she essentially killed him, which I think is just, she was sterilized and her son was killed. So, that level of petty is pretty understandable. Because Nzinga was angry at the Portuguese for going on their peace treaty, she renounced Christianity, started to build an army of freed Portuguese slaves, as well as enlisted young people into these militias, and incited a war against the Portuguese that was to last for the next 30 years. Eventually, in 1926, after suffering defeat after defeat, she fled from Dongo and began to slip into a bit of a depression. After about a month, though, she came out of her room, pulled herself towards herself, and began a new campaign to repair her relationship with her kingdom. At first, she tried to regain their trust by sowing seeds of mistrust in the Ndongan people for their current leader, who was the Portuguese sympathizer. But then the Portuguese came after, they defeated her again, and then she was like, okay, wait, let me just... So she looked around in her area and started to look for allies. Not too long after, what happened was the king of an Imbangalan tribe that was fairly new, called Kasanje, actually contacted Nzinga, and he was like, okay, why don't we get married, we join alliances, but you have to forego some of your Ndonganness. Don't ask me about her previous husband, because I actually couldn't work out where he went. Did she just kill him? So she agreed, and she was quite easily adopted into Imbangalan society, even partaking in some of their cannibalistic rituals, like drinking human blood, rubbing the oil derived from murdered infants on her body, all kind of in an attempt to rise to a powerful female position in the Imbangalan military. That's a bit deep. But at least she's got a cool comeback story, So Nzinga perfectly mixed her Mbundu heritage and the Imbangalan tradition and structure freed some more slaves, helped herself build up an army. And the nice thing about the Mbangalan people is that they didn't actually care about her gender. All they really cared about was good leadership and religious fervor. From 1631, she waged guerrilla warfare against the Portuguese, while at the same time trying to overthrow the kingdom of Matamba, which she was actually successful in doing in 1635. She used Matamba to create a stable power home base from which she would then take over her previous kingdom, Ndongo, as well as expand the slave trade in the kingdom of Matamba so that she could cut off some income supply to the Portuguese, as well as finance her own guerrilla warfare that was happening at the time. Nzinga continued as such for the next decade, and as time moved on, she began to adopt more masculine traits as well as male titles and dress. She apparently had an all-female bodyguard, and all of her concubines were male, had to dress in female clothing, and referred to her as king. What a badass. By this time, the Dutch had been snooping around Central Africa, also looking for black ivory, slaves, the usual. And they had started forming alliances with Kingdom of Congo. In 1941, what they did was they actually took over the port of Luanda and drove the Portuguese out. Now, Nzinga, seeing this, because she was smart, she was like, okay, I'm going to send out some word and we're going to form an alliance with the Dutch. You must understand, at this point, she was fierce, okay? Nzinga was unstoppable. She had the monopoly over the Central African slave trade. She had amassed an army of 80,000 mercenaries, and she was just taking over pieces of land right and left, to a point where the surrounding kingdoms were getting super stressed about her being around. She had the Ndongan noblemen on her side. Her slave trade was booming. She was amassing firearms for all of her wars, and she was actually Portugal's greatest threat in Africa. Now, unfortunately, unbeknownst to Nzinga, the Dutch had actually been driven out of Central Africa by the Portuguese, so they got in a boat and they went away. At the same time, she was fighting a war with the Portuguese, which she then actually lost, so things went a little sideways. The Portuguese kidnapped her sister, Kambu. They also found out that her sister, who was currently in captivity, Fungi, had actually been relaying Portuguese's battle plans to Nzinga. So what they did was they drowned her in the river. As a result of this loss, she retreated further inland. Between the 1640s and 50s, Nzinga again adopted some Christianity, aiming to get a political foothold in Europe once more by getting sympathetic priests to liaise between Nzinga and the Vatican. By 1656, both sides, Portugal and Nzinga, were so exhausted from the ongoing war that they were willing to begin negotiations for a new peace treaty agreement. The most beautiful part for Nzinga, and to signify the culmination of her difficult diplomatic work, was when her last sister, Kambu, was returned to the kingdom, and the kingdom all clapped to signify the recognition of the peace treaty between Portugal and them. Post-war Nzinga took on a more feminine approach to her kingdom. She was remarried. Again, I'm really not sure what happened to the previous ones. She abolished concubinage. She started to wear more silks. She had a focus on education. She allowed other women to bear children because previously they weren't allowed to. And she started to focus on rebuilding this land that was ravaged by war for all these years. She continued to hold the monopoly of the slave trade in the Central African region, and she set up her sister to be her predecessor once she passed. Sadly, on the 17th of December 1663, at aged 81, Nzinga finally passed away from a supposed throat infection that had moved to her lungs. She was buried in both Christian and Mbundu traditional ceremonies and was honored throughout the different kingdoms across Africa, as well as being hailed throughout Europe. Soon after her passing, there were many stories being told about her, and these stories and roots have persisted to this day. She became the face of Angolan independence, and even though her history is slightly controversial, she's still seen as the mother of Angola, an incredible diplomat, and a fearless leader. Nzinga is seen as an important figure in the roots of African nationalism for her persistent resistance to colonial rule throughout her lifetime, and she honestly inspires African women like me to never back down. Whew, that was a long one and that was a lot of information. But can you blame me for being so excited? I mean, she's so cool. There's amazing, gender fluid, independent African queen. Like, I really wish I knew the story sooner. If you were inspired by anything that you heard today, if you want to share anything that you know about Nzinga or the area or the region, please leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. I realized that I probably shouldn't do so much under eye correction because on the camera it looks really light, so don't worry, I get it, I see it. If you like today's video, please consider subscribing. Like I said, more of this content will come every so often Wednesday. Like I said, I am in South Korea for a show. If you are interested in anything that I'm doing other than this, you can follow me on TikTok or Instagram, where I post a lot more content on like my day-to-day life. So this is my final look. Yeah, I don't know why I keep choosing to do straight lines because it's so difficult to do while I'm talking, but I mean, I think it came out alright. Like I said, share, like, subscribe if you like the content. Have a wonderful day further. Don't forget to be kind to everybody that you interact with, and I'll see you next time.